The applause started before my stepson finished his sentence. That's how it works in rooms like that. People read the room and clap when they sense they're supposed to. He stood at the head of the table in a charcoal suit I'd paid for. Under lighting I'd chosen because I'd reserved the private dining room 3 months in advance, and he smiled the way he always smiled when attention found him. Comfortable, easy, like it was his natural habitat. "I want to thank everyone who believed in me," he said. I waited. My wife reached for her wine glass. Her sister leaned forward. The senior partners at the firm nodded with the patient warmth of men who had heard many speeches. He thanked his mother. He thanked his biological father, who had missed most of his childhood but had apparently earned a mention by showing up twice in the last decade. He thanked his professors. He thanked the firm. He thanked his college roommate, who was seated 3 chairs to my left. Then he raised his glass. "Making partner," he said, "is proof that if you work hard enough, you don't need anyone to hand you anything." Laughter. Applause. My wife touched his arm from her seat, beaming. I sat at the far end of the table and said nothing. I had a glass of water in front of me. I hadn't touched it. He didn't say my name. He didn't look in my direction. And when his eyes passed over the table in that practiced sweep that speakers use to seem inclusive, they skipped past me the way you skip past furniture you've stopped noticing. My wife laughed at something his sister said. She didn't look at me either. I'd felt this particular silence before. Not this loud, not this public, but the shape of it was familiar. The way a room can make you feel like a painting on the wall, present, decorative, never consulted. I set my napkin on the table and excused myself quietly. No one asked where I was going. I've been in operations my whole working life. 40 years managing logistics, contracts, supply chains for a mid-sized manufacturing firm. Before I retired at 62, I ran a division of 300 people. My job, for 4 decades, was to make things work smoothly without anyone noticing the machinery. When things ran well, no one called. When something broke, I fixed it before morning. I was good at invisibility because I'd been trained to believe it was a virtue. I met my wife 11 years ago at a conference in Cincinnati. She was sharp, warm, and honest about her life in a way that felt rare. She had 2 children from her first marriage, a daughter who lived in Portland, and a son who was, at the time, halfway through his 2nd year of law school. Her son was 26. I was 52. We started carefully, the way you do when the stakes are real. I didn't push. I didn't try to be anyone's father. I offered to help when it made sense, and I stepped back when it didn't. What I didn't expect was how quickly helping quietly would become the structural foundation nobody mentioned out loud. Law school, for those who haven't experienced it financially, is relentless. Tuition, bar prep courses, the suits you need before you can afford suits, the apartment in a city where rent requires a co-signer or a substantial deposit. My stepson was bright and driven, and almost entirely broke in the way that law students are broke, not from irresponsibility, but from the sheer arithmetic of the thing. "He's so stressed," my wife told me one evening, about 8 years ago, sitting at the kitchen counter with a phone bill in her hand. "I just want to help him, but I've already stretched what I can do." "What does he need?" I asked. She looked at the bill. "His rent's 3 months behind, and bar prep starts in 6 weeks. I covered it. Not because I was asked directly, because the alternative was watching someone I'd committed to care about sink when I had the means to help. I told myself it was temporary. That's what you tell yourself. It wasn't temporary. It became the arrangement, unnamed and unacknowledged, the way arrangements become invisible when they work too well. Bar prep fees, moving costs when he took the job in the city, a car when his broke down 2 months before he passed the bar, a loan which became a gift, gradually, by way of the subject never being raised again when his first apartment deposit came due. Over 7 years, I calculated once, in a moment of strange clarity late at night with a spreadsheet open on my laptop, I had contributed just over $94,000 to my stepson's professional foundation, not including the smaller things, the dinners before big interviews, the suit I'd bought him for his first deposition, the weekend I'd flown out to help him move into his current apartment because my wife had a work trip and he'd asked if anyone could help. I'd said yes without thinking about it. That was the pattern. I said yes without thinking about it. The restaurant was on the 43rd floor, a private dining room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. I'd called ahead 3 months ago when my wife told me the firm was announcing partnership decisions in the fall. I'd wanted it to be special. I'd reserved the room, confirmed the menu, and put my card on file for the bill. I stood in the corridor outside the dining room now, looking at the city through a window in the hallway. The light was fading, the city settling into its evening arrangement. Somewhere below, traffic moved in patterns I could almost read from up here. Efficient, predictable, going where it was supposed to go. A young woman from the restaurant staff appeared at my side. She had a tablet in her hands, and the careful expression of someone paid to solve problems discreetly. "Mr. Hartley," she said, "is everything all right?" "Yes," I said. "I need to make a change to the billing arrangement." She nodded, pulling up the reservation. "Of course. What would you like to adjust?" I looked back through the glass door at the dining room. My stepson was still talking, working the table now, moving between the senior partners with the ease of a man who had just arrived somewhere he believed he'd earned entirely alone. "I'd like to remove my card from the file," I said, "the pre-authorization for the room and the meal." She hesitated for exactly 1 second. "That's the primary card on the reservation." "I know. I'd like it removed." "Do you have a replacement method?" "No," I said. "I'm leaving the billing open." She looked at me steadily, understanding something without being told the particulars. "I'll need to notify the manager." "That's fine," I said. "Please keep it quiet. No announcements." "Of course." She made a note. "The room charge and the meal have already accumulated. Someone will need to cover." "Yes," I said. "Someone will." She nodded and moved away without further ceremony. I stayed at the window another moment, watching the city, letting the decision settle. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt accurate. I returned to my seat. The table had moved on to dessert menus. My wife glanced at me when I sat, a brief look, the kind that asks a question without committing to it. I picked up my water glass and drank. She turned back to the conversation. My stepson was telling a story about a case, something about a deposition that had turned unexpectedly, a witness who changed his testimony mid-session. The senior partners were engaged, leaning in. He was good at this. He had always been good at commanding a table, at making the room feel like it was lucky to be listening. I'd watched him develop that gift over a decade. I'd paid for the education that had sharpened it. "The thing is," he said, "I never needed anyone to clear a path for me. I just needed the chance to show what I was capable of." His mother nodded. I watched a partner across the table, a man in his late 60s, silver-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who listens more than he speaks. His name was Richard. He'd been with the firm for over 30 years. My stepson had mentioned him occasionally, with the careful respect reserved for someone you're trying to impress. Richard was looking at my stepson with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not quite agreement, something more careful. "That's a good instinct," Richard said evenly. "Self-reliance is worth cultivating." He paused, picking up his coffee cup. "Though I find, in my experience, that the people who built things entirely alone are rarer than they believe." My stepson laughed easily. "I just meant that I didn't take shortcuts." "Of course," Richard said. The conversation moved on, but Richard's eyes found mine briefly, across the long table, and for a moment I had the sense that he saw more of the room than he was letting on. The check arrived 40 minutes later. I knew the moment it happened because the energy at the table changed. The server presented the leather folder to my stepson's standard practice, since the reservation was technically under his name, though my card had been the payment method. He opened it with the relaxed confidence of a man who expects paperwork to resolve itself. His expression shifted. He looked at the total. He looked at the folder again. He glanced toward the server, who was standing at a respectful distance. "Is there an issue with the card on file?" he asked quietly. "The card was removed earlier this evening, sir," the server said, "per the cardholder's request." My stepson looked up, not at me, at his mother. My wife set down her fork. She understood immediately. I could see it in the way her shoulders dropped, just slightly, the way they do when something she'd been managing quietly stops being manageable. "I'm sorry," she said to the table, her voice calm but with something thin running through it. "Give us just a moment." She looked at me. This time she held my gaze. "What did you do?" she asked softly. "I removed my card," I said. "Why?" "Because I wanted to see what happened." Around us, the table had gone still in the way that dinner tables go still, when something private becomes public without anyone planning it. The senior partners were quiet. The roommate studied his dessert plate. My stepson sat at the head of the table with his jaw set and his eyes on me, and for the first time all evening, I had his full attention. "This isn't appropriate," my wife said. "The check needs to be paid," I said. That's appropriate. My stepson leaned forward. You're doing this now? Tonight? I didn't do anything tonight, I said. I just stopped doing something. You're embarrassing my wife. His voice dropped. You're embarrassing this family. I'm sitting quietly at a table, I said. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't said anything to your colleagues. I simply asked the restaurant to remove the card I'd placed on file. You're making a scene. Am I? I looked around the table. Has anyone raised their voice? Has anyone made an announcement? No one answered. The silence was its own kind of answer. Richard set his coffee cup down with a small, deliberate click. He looked at my stepson, then at me, and something in his expression had changed from careful to something more direct. If you don't mind, he said, to no one in particular, I'd like to ask a question. My stepson's eyes moved to him. Richard. It's a simple question, Richard said. It won't take long. He looked at my stepson with the steady attention of a man who had spent a career reading witnesses. You gave a very fine speech earlier. You mentioned your father, your professors, the firm. He paused. Who paid for your bar prep course? The table held its breath. My stepson said nothing. The Kaplan course, Richard said. The one you mentioned to me when you first interviewed, because I'd asked what you considered your most important preparation. He waited. You told me your family had helped with the cost. I assumed at the time that you meant your father. My mother helped, my stepson said. Richard looked at my wife. She met his gaze for a moment and then looked at the tablecloth. And your apartment deposit, Richard continued, without accusation, without drama, just the measured patience of someone following a thread. You told me you'd had help with that too when you first moved here. That without some assistance, the timeline wouldn't have worked. People help each other, my stepson said. They do, Richard agreed. Which is why it's worth knowing who helped. He turned, just slightly, to look at me. I don't believe his stepfather, I said. 11 years. Richard nodded slowly. He looked back at my stepson. I've known you 7 years, Richard said. In that time, you've told me about your drive, your discipline, and your independence. I've never once heard you mention your stepfather. He said it without judgment, which somehow made it sharper. Given what I'm seeing tonight, I'm wondering if there's a chapter of the story I was never told. The room was completely silent now. My stepson looked at his plate. Something was working through his face, not shame, exactly, but the beginning of something adjacent to it. The kind of recalibration that happens when a story you've been telling yourself for years is quietly contradicted in front of an audience. It wasn't like that, he said. What was it like? Richard asked. My stepson looked at his mother. She said nothing. Her hands were folded on the table, and she was looking at them. I earned my position, my stepson said. No one gave me my career. No, I said quietly. No one gave you your career. You worked for it. That part was always yours. He looked at me. Something flickered. But someone paid for the tools, I said. That's all. That's the only part that was left out. My wife followed me into the corridor 20 minutes later. After the bill had been split in a way that required a quiet conversation between my stepson and the manager and involved, I assumed a credit card that was used to a different kind of pressure than it was accustomed to. She walked toward me slowly. She didn't look angry. She looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been holding something at arm's length for a long time and has run out of arm. You could have talked to me, she said. I did, I said, more than once. You said he was proud, that he'd come around, that it was just how he expressed things. She exhaled. He's not good at gratitude. He never has been. That's not aimed at you. I know it's not aimed at me, I said. That's the problem. None of it was aimed at me. I wasn't present enough to aim anything at. She looked toward the dining room door. Richard. I didn't ask Richard to do anything. I know, she said, but it'll change how they see him at the firm. I hope it changes how he sees himself, I said. She looked at me for a long moment. In 11 years of marriage, I had learned her silences the way you learn the sounds a house makes. Which ones are just settling? Which ones mean something is wrong? This silence meant something was wrong. Not with her, exactly. With the thing we'd built and the ground it had been built on. I didn't think it mattered this much to you, she said finally. I didn't either, I said, until tonight when it was summarized in public. What was summarized? That I'm not part of the story, I said. That the years and the money and the quiet presence all happened, and the conclusion drawn from it was that none of it happened. She swallowed. That's not what I believe. I know, I said, but you didn't correct it. That landed between us and stayed there. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the floor, then back at me. I waited. I'd learned in 63 years that the moments worth having are the ones where you wait instead of fill the silence. I should have said something, she said. During the speech, I should have said his name. Yes, I said, simply, not as a wound, as a fact. Her eyes went wet, briefly. She pressed them still. I didn't want to make him uncomfortable. You made me invisible instead. She nodded once, slowly. The kind of nod that means I know, not I agree. There's a difference, and she knew I could hear it. What do you want to do? She asked. Tonight, I said, I want to drive home and sleep in my own bed and not have a large conversation. She nodded again. And after that? After that, I said, I think we need to be honest with each other about some things we've been deferring. My stepson came to the house 4 days later. He called first, which was unusual enough that I noted it. He arrived on a Saturday morning, parked in the driveway, and stood at the front door with his hands in his jacket pockets. I saw him through the window before I opened the door. He looked different, not smaller, exactly, more present, like a man who had spent several days with a thought he hadn't asked for and had stopped trying to put it down. I opened the door before he knocked. Come in, I said. He sat at the kitchen table. I made coffee. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Outside, the yard was beginning to turn. Late October, the maples had gone amber and red and were dropping slowly, one decision at a time. I've been thinking, he said. I figured, I said. Richard pulled me aside Monday. He looked at his hands. He said some things. I didn't ask him to. I know, he said. He said that too. A pause. He said that the men who are hardest to impress are usually the ones who helped you the most. That it's psychological. You want to believe you outran their help. He was quiet. He said he'd seen it before, that it never looks as clean from the outside as it feels from the inside. I poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him. I'm not here to argue that you didn't work, I said. You did. You worked very hard. The career is yours. But, he said, but nobody does it alone, I said. Not really. And the ones who insist they did usually had someone quiet standing behind them, making sure the floor didn't fall out while they were looking up. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. He had his mother's hands' long fingers, always moving slightly, even when he was still. I didn't think about it the way you did, he said. I thought the money was just family, that it wasn't supposed to be mentioned because it was just what families did. When families do something, I said, they're part of the story. That's the difference. He nodded. He stared at the table for a moment, then looked at me directly. It was the most direct he'd looked at me in years. I left you out of the speech, he said, on purpose. I let that sit. Not to hurt you, he continued, or not only that. I think I wanted the version where I did it alone. I've been telling that version for so long that it started to feel true. He exhaled. And then Richard asked one question and the whole thing just came apart. I drank my coffee. The maple outside dropped a leaf, slow and indifferent. I don't need credit, I said. I never did it for credit. I did it because you were my wife's son and you needed help and I had the means to help. That's a clean reason. It doesn't require anything in return. But, he said again, but invisible isn't the same as selfless, I said. I was invisible because it was convenient for everyone else, not because I chose it. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, a car passed. A dog barked somewhere down the street. I owe you an apology, he said. Yes, I said. You do. I'm sorry. He said it without decoration. Just the words, placed plainly on the table. I'm sorry I left you out. I'm sorry I told myself a story that erased you. I'm sorry I didn't say your name. I sat with that for a moment. Let it be what it was. Thank you, I said. He nodded. He picked up his coffee and drank. We sat there for a while, the two of us, in the ordinary quiet of a Saturday morning, not fixing anything dramatically, not forgiving in the way people do in movies, just sitting, which is how things actually begin to change. The conversation with my wife took longer. That's how it goes when a marriage is involved. When the thread you're pulling is woven into everything else and you can't remove it without feeling the whole fabric shift. We talked for 3 evenings, calmly. She was not a cruel person. She had never been a cruel person. What she had been was a mother first. in the way that parents sometimes are, in the way that isn't conscious but shapes everything. She had raised her son through a divorce in a hard decade, and she had learned, somewhere in that process, to protect him from discomfort before the discomfort could teach him anything. I had been a convenient extension of that protection, a resource that asked nothing, recorded nothing, expected nothing publicly, until I did. I leaned on you, she said, on the second evening, more than I told you I was doing, because you never said no. I know, I said. I should have made him acknowledge it, she said, a long time ago. Not for your sake, for his. Yes, I said. Are you leaving? She asked. I looked at her. 11 years. The woman I'd married because she was honest and warm and real. She was still those things. She had also been complicit in something that had made me feel, in moments, like furniture. I don't know yet, I said. I need some time to know the answer to that. She nodded. That's fair. I don't want to make a decision from a place of hurt, I said. I want to make it from a place of clarity. What would clarity look like? She asked. It would look like this, I said. This conversation. You saying what you said, him coming on Saturday, the truth being the truth instead of the comfortable version of the truth. She looked at me with something open and worn in her expression, the way people look when they've stopped performing and are just present. I love you, she said. I know, I said. I need it to look like something, though. That's all I'm asking. I went to see my own doctor that November, a checkup I'd been putting off. The way men my age put things off when they're busy managing other people's lives. He cleared me, told me my blood pressure was better than last year, asked if I'd been under stress. I laughed, which surprised him. Some, I said. Less than before. He nodded. Whatever you changed, keep doing it. I thought about that on the drive home. Whatever you changed, keep doing it. What I had changed was simple. When I held it plainly, I had stopped treating my own presence as a burden to be minimized. I had stopped financing my own erasure. I had sat at a dinner table and let the truth surface the way truth surfaces, when you stop holding it underwater, not with explosion, not with accusation, just with the simple refusal to keep it down. The groom from a story I'd once heard, not my story, but one that had settled somewhere useful in the back of my mind, had done something similar. He'd asked a question the room could no longer avoid. I hadn't asked a question. I'd removed a card from a billing folder. Different gesture, same essential truth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of people avoiding something is simply to stop pretending alongside them. My stepson called me the following week. Not to apologize again, he'd done that, cleanly, and neither of us was the type to revisit it until it became a performance. He called to ask if I wanted to come to his firm's holiday dinner in December. As a guest, he said he'd told a colleague about me, and the colleague had asked if I'd be joining. I mentioned you, he said. As my stepfather, I wanted you to know. I sat with that for a moment. I'll think about it, I said. That's fair, he said. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a while. The house was quiet. My wife was at a book club, the kind of ordinary Tuesday evening that makes up the texture of a long life. The coffee in front of me had gone cold while I was on the phone. I thought about what it had cost me. Over the years, not the money, which was a number, and numbers are just numbers. I thought about the quieter cost, the habit of making myself small so other people could feel large. The belief, which I'd held without examining it, that love meant accommodation without limit and presence without acknowledgement. That being needed was enough, even when being needed was the only role I was allowed. It wasn't enough. It had never been enough. It had just been, for a long time, the only option I had presented to myself. That was the part that required the most honesty. Not what they had done, what I had allowed. The way I had handed out $94,000 and my presence and my labor, and then been surprised when no one could see it, because I had wrapped it so carefully in silence that it had become invisible by design. You cannot ask people to notice what you have trained them not to look at. The maple in the yard had gone bare now. Just the branches, precise and dark against a gray November sky. There was something I found honest about a tree in November. No performance, no concealment, just the actual shape of the thing, without ornament. I picked up my cold coffee and drank the rest of it. My phone showed a text from my wife, home by 9. I'll pick up soup from the place on Clement if you want. I typed back, yes, thank you. Small things, but they were the real architecture. Not the speeches, not the dinner tables. The daily choosing of each other, or the daily failing to. The question, at 63, was not whether I had been wronged. I had been, in the specific and common way that quiet people are wronged by the noisy world's habit of overlooking them. The question was what I would do with the space that the truth had opened up. I had some ideas. None of them were dramatic. All of them involved being seen. That was enough to begin. If anything in what I've told you tonight felt familiar, that particular tightening in your chest when you recognize the shape of your own silence, then you know what I know. The cost of invisibility is not paid all at once. It's paid slowly, in the small moments when you don't speak and they don't notice and the gap grows another inch. And one day you find yourself at a dinner table with your name left out of a speech and you realize the gap is a canyon. You don't have to make a scene. You just have to stop being scenery. Thank you for staying with me tonight. If this story sat with you in some way that matters, leave a thought in the comments. I read them. And if you'd like to hear more about quiet choices and the long road to saying what needs to be said, subscribe. We'll keep walking.